My name is Maggie. I am an office worker at a leading company. One day, I met a man named Scott and started dating him, eventually accepting his proposal and getting married. I thought marrying him, who seemed mentally stable, might lead to a happy marriage, but later realized it was a big mistake. The first time I met Scott was at a matchmaking event organized by the company I work for. Although anyone who was single and an ordinary person could attend, I decided to go too. Honestly, I wasn't very enthusiastic about attending such events, but because my company was hosting it, I was persuaded to attend, with the suggestion that it might lead to a good encounter. Scott and I naturally started talking as we were seated close to each other. He was 5 years older than me, 30, and seemed to have a calm demeanor. Gradually, both of us became conscious of each other. Soon, Scott and I started dating. He always wore high-brand clothes and paid for our dates. I wondered if he was wealthy, but felt a bit guilty always being treated. Still, I was attracted to his personality and continued the relationship. Then one day, Scott proposed to me. I had no intention of marrying for wealth, but I liked the kind Scott and accepted his proposal. When I visited Scott's family home for marriage greetings, I was surprised by the luxurious house and its large garden. "Scott, is your family wealthy?" I asked out of surprise, without any deep meaning. "Really? This is nothing special. Just ordinary," Scott joked in response to my question. Even so, it was obvious that such a luxurious house couldn't be afforded by an average employee. His mother was also dressed expensively, and I became curious about what kind of person his father was. Thinking back, Scott rarely talked about his father. He wasn't home that day either. "Is Steve not here today? Is he out?" "Well, my husband isn't in good health and is in a facility," I asked out of courtesy, but felt the expression of Scott's mother harden a bit as she answered. I was surprised to hear his father was in a facility, a fact unknown to me until today. This made me feel something was off. This unease I felt would become clear in the married life that was about to start. After getting married, Scott suggested, "Can't you live with me and my mother in our family home? I'm worried about leaving her alone." I wanted to live just with my husband, but I understood Scott's feelings. My parents were still actively working, so I agreed to live with Scott's family. Once I started living in Scott's family home, I encountered surprising scenes. On the day of the move, the house was more cluttered than when I first visited. Laundry piled up for days, and it seemed cleaning wasn't done. Perhaps Scott's mother was too busy to manage household chores. I decided not to mind it. But first, I had something to tell Scott. We're a couple now, so I'll also pay for living expenses. I always felt guilty for being treated during our dating. I wanted to contribute financially, even while living in Scott's family home. "Maggie, you don't have to worry about money." Despite thinking it's important to be responsible with money, Scott always dismisses the topic with his usual attitude. During this conversation, Jane chimed in. "God is right, we have plenty of money, so don't worry. More importantly, that woman can't even do household chores properly. She's useless and I'm going to fire her today." I was surprised by her strong tone, but what caught my attention was her reference to "that woman." Scott, who was the woman she was talking about? "Oh, she's the housekeeper we've hired. She does various chores but is pretty useless. She's coming this afternoon, but Mom probably plans to fire her today." Hearing this, I thought, the house is big. But is it necessary to have a housekeeper? Jane doesn't seem to work. She could do the chores herself. Of course, I couldn't say this out loud. However, when I saw the housekeeper working, she didn't seem particularly bad. Rather, she was efficiently managing the housework. I guess the house must have been tidy from her last visit, when I first came to greet for the marriage. To my concern, while the housekeeper was working, Jane was just snacking and watching TV, occasionally sighing and looking disdainfully at the housekeeper. To me, the housekeeper seemed to be working hard, but I wondered what Jane disliked about her. Moreover, after the housekeeper finished her day's work, Jane said to her, "Why are you always so slow? You're fired as of today. Here, your last pay. Don't come back tomorrow." She was fired unilaterally, and Jane even threw her last pay at her. Anyone would think such treatment is too harsh. The housekeeper must have been shocked. Tears rolled down her cheeks. After the housekeeper left, Jane made a shocking announcement to me. "So that's it. From now on, you're in charge of the housework. Okay?" I was told unilaterally and felt nothing but anxiety. I feared being exploited as a housekeeper by Jane from now on. However, the next day, my bad feeling became a reality. Jane started pushing all household chores on me. Cooking 3 meals, laundry, cleaning everyone's rooms, and even gardening. But I have work during the day. When I mentioned this to Jane, she said, "Just do it after returning home. You can prepare lunch in the morning. You can do that much, right?" Scott heard this, but did not intervene, showing an expression as if it was all obvious. At first, I thought it was a joke, but Jane was serious. Thus, I began a daily struggle to balance work and housework, while Jane continued to live freely, doing nothing. She went for luxurious hotel buffet lunches with friends, a lifestyle far from ordinary. Scott drove around in a luxury car. I couldn't help but wonder how they could afford such an extravagant lifestyle. Even if Scott earned a good salary, such lavish living by the mother and son was unlikely. Then I remembered Scott's father, whom I had never met. I hadn't greeted him since marrying, and being family, I wanted to meet and talk to him. I asked Scott where his father was staying. He replied indifferently, "What are you going to do by meeting my dad? It's pointless." Still, I felt it was polite to meet him at least once as a family. So, without telling Scott or Jane, I decided to visit Steve's facility. When I met Steve, he was quite surprised. Understandably, no one expects their son's wife to visit suddenly. After calming down, Scott's father shared various stories with me, many of which I had never known. Steve's father used to run a small shop, supporting the family's livelihood. However, when he suddenly fell ill, young Steve had to take over the shop. Steve was gifted in business and thought that just running the shop wouldn't suffice for future survival. He believed in expanding the business, even going into debt to start managing restaurants and recycling shops. This venture turned out to be a huge success, providing a stable and significant income. Now it made sense. The extravagant lifestyle of Jane and Scott was thanks to Steve's earnings. Hearing this story from Steve, I felt a sense of kinship. This was because my own father also ran a business when he was young. Perhaps my father had foresight too, predicting the upcoming era of IT, which wasn't common back then. He studied computers diligently. He opened a shop dealing with computer peripherals and repairs, which turned out to be a hit, ensuring a comfortable life for my family. Although not as profitable as Steve's ventures, I felt compelled to share my feelings honestly with him. "You've put in so much effort to expand your business to this extent. It's truly amazing." Steve, blushing with a shy smile, responded, No, it's all thanks to my father. He laid the foundation of the business, which is why we have this life now." It was clear that Steve held deep respect for his own father. I felt the same pride for my father. As I continued talking with Steve, I grew to cherish him more. Afterward, I frequently visited the facility where Steve resided. Then, one day, he expressed his discontent. I'm really glad to have a daughter-in-law like Maggie. Those two hardly ever visit me. Moreover, they are reckless with money. Blinded by greed. I never wanted to entrust them with the money. Hearing this, I remembered the discomfort I felt about Scott and Jane's lavish lifestyle. They were recklessly spending Steve's money and exploiting people. I thought of them as despicable. After a period of silence, Steve spoke again. I'll be passing away soon. I'm so glad I met you before that. This was because he had heard from his primary doctor at the facility about his limited time left. My eyes blurred with tears as I looked at him. Upon returning to the family home, the extravagant lifestyle of the two continued unchanged. In fact, since I started living with them, their attitudes seemed to grow even worse. I felt compelled to discuss Steve with them. So, I asked, "Why don't you visit your father, Scott? No need to go to that old man's place. It's none of your business, so don't interfere." Scott suddenly lashed out with venom. "Really, Maggie, what are you talking about? We tolerated that overly serious man. Of course, we married him for his money. Without it, he's just an annoying old man. Scott is right, it's none of your business. Don't meddle anymore, it's unpleasant." Jane's words were just as harsh. My anger reached its peak. Despite Steve's hardships providing for their current lifestyle, they spent his money carelessly and said such horrible things. At that moment, I vowed in my heart to fully support Steve. A few weeks after this incident, sad news arrived. Steve had passed away. Although I was prepared for such news eventually, the reality of it brought unstoppable tears. In response, Scott and his mother didn't seem sad about the passing of Steve. Instead, they appeared to be almost happy. I overheard their conversation. It seems that Steve left a fortune of $4 million. And they were acting as if it was already theirs. Such despicable people, consumed by greed. They didn't mourn Steve's death but were excited about the inheritance. Completely carried away, the two were saying things like, "Now we can live even better, Scott, and great. I'll quit my job too." Then Jane said something shocking. "Well, it's a hassle, but we should at least hold a funeral. Once that's over, the inheritance is ours," she laughed. Then, turning to me, "Oh, that's right, Maggie. You don't need to come to the funeral. You're an outsider. Please don't get involved with us anymore." It felt like she was saying, "There's no inheritance for you." There were no words beyond a demon or a devil to describe them. I realized I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I had already made up my mind. A few days ago, when I visited Steve, he had mentioned his time was near. I knew I might not be able to see him again. While he still had strength, I had spoken with him as much as possible and said my goodbyes. So, I calmly replied to Jane, "Understood. I won't attend the funeral." Then, turning to Scott, "In exchange, please sign this." I presented him with divorce papers. Scott looked surprised, but Jane seemed almost pleased. Perhaps she thought that without the marriage, I wouldn't get any inheritance. Pressured by his mother, Scott, though bewildered, signed the divorce papers. "You can't be serious," muttering to himself. While Scott and his mother were busy with funeral preparations, I neatly packed up my room, arranged my belongings, and contracted for a new apartment. I explained the situation to my parents and workplace. And by the time Steve's funeral was over, I had already left the family home. Scott and his mother were probably feeling relieved by now. Even before starting the funeral preparations, they had booked flights and luxury hotels for an overseas trip. However, they couldn't imagine the retribution that awaited them. It started the day after I left the family home. I received a call from Jane. I couldn't answer as I was at work, but later saw dozens of missed calls on my phone. I continued to ignore calls from Jane. I didn't want to answer, knowing what she would say. When Jane's calls went unanswered, Scott started calling persistently. They were in a serious predicament. But it was too late. Steve had completely disowned them. I continued not to answer their calls. However, knowing them, I anticipated they might contact my workplace or my parents. But I had already planned for this. My parents had moved to the apartment I rented. And no one knew their new address. As expected, a few weeks later, Scott and Jane visited my parents' house. I had already informed my neighbors to contact me if they caused any disturbance. My intuition was right, they were asking around for my whereabouts, causing trouble for the neighbors, who informed me. I immediately contacted the police, asking them to check on the disturbance. The police arrived swiftly and sternly warned Scott and his mother, preventing them from approaching the family home area again. Afterward, my parents occasionally returned to their original house for cleaning and chores. However, Scott and his mother didn't quiet down and even visited my workplace. But I had already informed the security guard at the entrance to tell them I had resigned if they came looking for me. However, Jane was not one to back down easily. I know that's a transparent lie. Bring her here immediately. She insisted, refusing to leave. Her persistence led the security guard to threaten to call the police. Reminded of the recent incident by the mention of the police, she finally gave up and left. The relentless pair continued to search for me. The phone calls kept coming, and they even went as far as to visit the city office, trying to find out my address. It was utterly exasperating. That's when they realized something. Since Scott and I were already divorced, my surname had naturally changed. At the city office, they found no record under my name. The two must have been utterly distraught upon learning this. So why were Jane and Scott so desperate to find me? The answer lay in Steve's will. The day after I left the family home, Jane came across the will. It stated, "All my inheritance goes to Maggie." Steve had expressed this during his lifetime. The reason Jane and Scott had become such selfish and unreasonable people was all his fault. He let them use money as they pleased. Furthermore, they treated him poorly, rejoiced when he entered the facility, and never visited. Why should he leave his inheritance to such people, even if they were family? Thus, Steve decided to leave all his inheritance to me, who had cared for him. Naturally, this meant Jane and Scott wouldn't receive a penny. The inheritance included the family home, making it my property. However, I didn't need Steve's lands or properties. I decided to sell them immediately. This was something I had discussed with Steve while he was alive, and had already arranged with a real estate agent. Therefore, Jane and Scott had to leave the family home. Scott, having quit his job in anticipation of the inheritance, was now unemployed. His work attitude had always been problematic, so the company readily accepted his resignation. The two, who had been excited about receiving $4 million, found themselves getting nothing, plummeting from heaven to hell. They couldn't go on their planned overseas trip, and had to pay cancellation fees for the booked flights and luxury hotels. That's why they were desperately looking for me. A year passed, and they seemed to have finally given up calling. Rumor has it that Jane and Scott now live in an old, dirty apartment without a bath, barely making ends meet with day jobs. The two, who never appreciated Steve's hard work and recklessly spent his money, hopefully learned a valuable lesson. They should work honestly and reform their lives. As for me, I decided to donate the entire inheritance to charity. Working hard to earn a fortune is commendable, but being wealthy doesn't necessarily bring happiness. It's better to save only what is necessary and use the rest for the good of the world. Money used for good deeds will eventually come back to you. These were beliefs shared by my father, Steve, and myself. Since I didn't earn the inheritance myself, it felt wrong to keep it all. I didn't approach Steve for his wealth, and my decision was made after consulting my parents. Now free from the clutches of Jane and Scott, I live peacefully, respecting my parents and cherishing the memories with Steve. I intend to continue living positively, holding these values dear.